Good evening. I'm so excited to welcome you all here to Humanities New York's first in-person event in quite a while. So we are very excited to welcome you to the fourth annual History and the American Imagination event. Tonight will be a conversation between Reginald Dwayne and Nicole Fleetwood, and I'm Diva Woodley. I'm an associate professor of politics at the New School, and I'm secretary of the board at Humanities New York. We begin this event by acknowledging that many of us are living on unceded land and traditional territories of indigenous peoples and original communities. We acknowledge our role as settlers on this territory, honoring those who have observed their roles and responsibilities to this land and water since time immemorial. Tonight, am here as a representative of Humanities New York. Founded in 1975, it is the sole statewide proponent of public access to the humanities in New York. HNY's vision is to create a vibrant, growing public humanities community that engages all New Yorkers in civic participation, volunteerism, philanthropy, and community involvement. Using dialogue, reflection, and critical thinking, Humanities New York applies the humanities to strengthen democratic society. The History and the American Imagination series examines how critical aspects of American history are represented in literature, film, music, and more. The series looks at the ways that history has informed our society and culture, and the unreliable connection, indeed, a tension between our memories and our past. In short, it is an exploration of the complex relationship between American history and the national imagination. The choice of speakers tonight has been directly inspired by HNY's Post-Incarceration Humanities Partnership Program, which provides funding and networking support for organizations in New York State that serve individuals who have been previously incarcerated, and in some cases also their families. We would like to thank the program's 2022 grantees. It's a cohort including Herstory Writers Workshop, The Incorrigibles, Ritual for Return, Roots, Wounds, Words, the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center of Columbia University, and Time Out of Joint. Humanities New York is grateful to the Mellon Foundation for recognizing the importance of this work and for generously supporting it, and for the genius and commitment of the people who are involved. Funding for tonight's program is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, a federal agency, thank you. Some of the individuals who made this possible include Hannah Scott and Lauren Wall of Lyceum Agency, Aaron Simpson and Maggie Farron at Simon & Schuster, ASL interpreters Johnny Collin and Bernadine Veronai at Sign Nexus, and finally, a big thank you to HNY's staff and board, especially Joe Murphy, the director of grant making, and Adam Capitano, also on staff, Evan Stewart, my colleague on the board, my colleague on our board and chair of the Outreach Committee, and our executive director of HNY, Sarah Oger, and then the chair of the board, Tim Murray. HNY is grateful to the Ford Foundation for the use of this state-of-the-art auditorium. I hope you all have had a chance to see the beautiful garden outside. And so we thank you all also for joining us here. It is now my honor to introduce tonight's speakers who will shed light on the experience of prison and the effects of mass incarceration in the United States, its history, and how it is represented in society and culture today. Dwayne Betts is a poet and prison reform advocate and the author of A Question of Freedom, a memoir of learning, survival, and coming of age in prison, and 3 collections of poetry, including most recently Felon, and a forthcoming work that I've just learned about that is called Redacted. Nicole R. Fleetwood, who is a professor of media, culture, and communication at New York University, and the author of Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness. Also, On Racial Icons, Blackness and the Public Imagination, and the exhibition and eponymous catalog, Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, a truly wondrous work. And so now, without further ado, I will pass the mic for the conversation between our two magnificent guests, and I'm so excited for us to enjoy it.
Cool.
Thank you.
So we talked about this before. We had a long argument about who would speak first. Because I'm a feminist, I decided that I was going to speak first.
Exactly.
And I never do this. You shouldn't read from your phone from a stage because it makes you look like you're trying to be younger than you are. But I wanted to read you something, and we talk about voice and agency and identity, and we'll talk about that a lot. So I wanted to start with a piece that appeared in the Yale Law Journal, written by James Davis III. Even when I say that, I have to say that James Davis III, a philosopher and a scholar, is currently incarcerated. And I pause because I don't actually want to identify him as a currently incarcerated person. I don't want to identify him as a prisoner, but in this context, it's important for me to say that, not just because of what he's writing, but because he is holding on to an identity that he wants to let go. And you can't let go of that identity without admitting that it's one that you possess. And so, James Davis III, the article is called Law, Prison, and Double Consciousness, I can't even pronounce this word, a phenomenological view of the Black prisoner's experience. Still just using these big words.
You're a poet.
I know. New World, New Consciousness. This is the start of section 2 of the piece. Prisoners refer to everything that exists outside the prison walls as the world. In so doing, prisoners are signaling the alienation that they experience. They experience this alienation completely. Everything that once constituted their identity, their sense of self, exists in that world. They are signaling that a dramatic shift in their existence has occurred. They are also signaling that everything within the prison walls constitutes something distinctly different from the world. The world is where their family and loved ones live. The world is where they once had self-determined relationships with others. Prison is a space without the most natural of loving relationships. The prisoner is separated from his children, his family, and friends. But he is also separated from all the houses, stores, streets, and other spaces that constitute his environment. He is separated from all of that, from all of the pieces that he used to construct his identity. Such separation has consequences that manifest in thoughts, feelings, and actions. The absence of sustained contact and of maintaining loving relationships with women and children leaves him in an emotional no man's land. His identity as a father, husband, brother, friend, lover, and provider is undermined. He may go years without receiving a loving embrace, without a kiss. This assault on his identity is a profound psychological trauma.
Thank you.
I wanted to read that and just see what you would say.
And I appreciate it so much because I think you know my way into this work is through my family's experience with incarceration. So I've never been incarcerated, but I grew up visiting people I love in prison. And the felt sense at 7, which was the first time I went to a prison to see my Uncle David, of separation is what I left with. And, you know, I always go back to that Etheridge Knight poem also about the photographs on the wall, right?
Idea of ancestry.
Yeah, the idea of ancestry. And I think that's one of the most profound experiences of incarceration, but also once the person's released from prison, that even once you're re-embraced, it's that time, right? Like that time, all those years of not having that contact, you can't undo it, right? It's impossible to undo it.
Which in some ways is, so for the audience and for the listeners, the idea of ancestry is a poem by Etheridge Knight that the first stanza is, it's written in like two stanzas, but the point is that the first part of the poem is talking about being with family, you know. Well, actually, the first part of the poem is talking about the 26 black faces taped to his cell wall. And then it begins to recount the history of these faces. And it talks about a cookout with kinfolks and how he had almost kicked the habit, but he couldn't. And it is in the end when you recognize and sort of realize why he's writing the poem in prison. And the very thing that he's writing about is that essential thing that's missing, though, that bond and that connection with family. So.
But you said something in your reading of that poem when we were talking about it earlier, about double consciousness. And I just wanted to hear more like your interpretation of what.
I mean, that's a good idea, and I wanted to talk about it to give him credit, because we were talking about how do you exist within the system, and how do you exist as a person that's like outside of the system as well, right? Like, how do you exist as a person in prison when you're trying to engage with the world? And I thought, we just said that. That's what he said. And his idea of double consciousness is talking about what it means to be a pace removed from what Du Bois talks about when you're living behind the veil. As if prison creates its own veil, its own view of seeing the world that is distinctly and radically different from what anybody else experiences. And even in the piece, he talks about prison might be the one place where your identity as a black person or a white person or whatever ethnicity you carry in the prison in some ways vanishes, because you begin to have an experience of the world based on being this other thing, which is a prisoner. And nobody radically understands it except the prisoner. But the question really, and so I read that and I cringe a little bit because it's also a choice to say that I live in prison and not the world. And I've said it, and I've written poems where I've said it, and I've felt it, that I lived in prison and not the world. Except I cringe when people ask me to identify myself as a formerly incarcerated person.
What does it mean to live in prison and not the world?
I mean,
As a choice.
Well, I say it's a choice in the sense that, like, my mama comes to see me, and I call on the phone, and I write letters to people. Like, I try my best to be connected to my family despite the brick and the mortar that holds me. You know, I don't want to imagine, I didn't do 30, 40, 50 years, but I don't want to imagine that was dead time. That was actually time where, like, I love people. Well, I didn't, actually. Like, that's the fucked up part about it, though. I could have made a decision to love people. I could have made a decision to find ways to be more generous. I could have made a decision to, like, I mean, if you do 25, I once came into this unit, man. My cell partner was this old head named Pops, and I came into the housing unit, man, and Pops was at the table crying, and he had been locked up for 25 years, you know, and he'd been locked up at the Wall. And if you ever been to a prison called the Wall, it's just like a dangerous, you know, violent place, right? And he grew up in the Wall, and he crying. I'm like, oh, man. I don't know what violence is about to follow this moment, but it's going to be serious, because men don't cry in public, and men in prison don't cry in public. Mm-hmm. And I went over, it was like, oh, Pops, what's happening, man? You know, everything all right? And all of the old heads was around him, you know, mm-hmm. And he had, you know, like a 50-year prison sentence. And he was like, you know, boy, I made papers. And the thing is, like, he was crying, this tears of like, I can't believe they're going to let me out of here. Mm-hmm. And, but his friends were around him. Mm-hmm. And they did have tenderness and care for each other. And I don't want to erase that in my realistic need to assert that prison is a distinctly different place from, you know, Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. I get it's distinct, I get it's different, but it's a way in which we hold on to that too much, and we actually don't want to touch the people that's been in prison. Mm-hmm. When I came home, people didn't want to touch me. Mm-hmm. You know, people didn't want to hug me. I mean, it took a whole lot of accomplishments for people to act like I don't have a stain on my skin. And so when I read what James is saying, I want to push back against him and say, no, you still live in the world. You live in a far region of the world that's akin to Siberia.
Yeah.
It's not funny.
But you said you didn't love in prison, and I know you're saying, I mean, I know what you mean by saying that, but also I know I've read you, and I read you when you were still in prison. I found out about you when you were in prison.
For real?
Yeah.
Motherfuckers knew about me when I was in prison? I can't wait to tell my mama this.
And we have a experience. The first time I met you in person was in 2014 at Rutgers.
Yeah.
We did an early version of Marking Time there, and I was doing research, and you were in law school. You were in your first semester of law school at Yale, and you came and you were the keynote speaker. But I was reading poetry, and I read one of your poems that just moved me so much, and I didn't know at the time you were in prison. I don't even know how I came across that poem. But I know that you've written about coming into consciousness and becoming a poet in prison. And we were talking, and to me, poetry is a form of love. I don't want to generalize what poetry is, but I don't know how you can write poetry if you don't love.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was really young when I was in prison. And I think, I wonder how my homies would talk about it, who aged. You know, like I was working on this my dissertation, yet as unfinished. And in fact, we should call you Dr. Fleetwood, you know. But I wanted to write about men who had experienced, like I experienced a tail end of puberty in prison. And I wanted to collect these oral histories of guys who I knew who did at least 20 years and got locked up before the age of 18. And I was thinking about people who experienced these serious, like, transformative life experiences while incarcerated. So from puberty to early adulthood to, like, the mid-20s to the 30s to, like, the early 40s. Like, people experienced all of that in prison because I thought that it was going to allow me to understand something about what it means to live in this world, right? And I think that people who have experienced those changes have a better sense of articulating what it means to care. Because at 21 and 22, I mean, you know, I didn't use words like love outside of, outside of like my mom and my family. But I didn't know what like, even the bond that I have for people that, you know, are still in prison now, that our bond would deepen over the years of me being free and them still being in prison. It took years for me to understand that as a kind of love. And so I think when I say that, yes, you have to have love to write poems, but I don't know, that's an admission, man. If you say you love somebody, you admit that you could be hurt.
Right.
By them and by what happens to them. And that's why it takes something to like crack the veneer of like toughness, which is, you know, this guy making parole when he was thinking he might die in prison. This is a 50-year-old man. You know, this isn't like a young boy. This is a dude that has seen more trauma in prison than he saw before he came to prison. And I mean, all he used to do was lift weights and carry around the Bible. And all of a sudden, like, he's going home and you see all of the toughness, like. So I don't know. It's an interesting question. But I guess my question for you, because what I'm saying is there's something that's ineffable about it. That even as a poet, I'm only reaching towards it. And in fact, as a poet in prison, I'm reaching more towards tragedy and sorrow than love at that time. But the artists, I feel like artists are always reaching towards something else. And so I wonder how you think artists and their work, particularly in your work in Marking Time, you feel like they are trying to capture something else. Because the truth is, like, a poem that has this like filled with sorrow is one thing. But I feel like people create art, they create visual images that's more. And so I wonder how you think that they're trying to, you know, I'm using what James said as both an assertion of a reality and a question of how they kind of fight against that reality. And I wonder how you think that the artists do that.
Yeah, I mean, as you were saying, you know, I'm struggling with what you're saying and what I've read of you, because to me your poetry is so infused with love. and looking back and looking forward. And I was wondering if there's a way that art and creative expression in prison functions as a space, a holding space, a space of world making for sure, but also a holding space for all of these emotions that you can't actually enact in the day the day in and out of prison, right? Like you can't enact that type of vulnerability, but I see it so much enfolded in art. Like one of the artists in Marking Time was saying, and he was someone who was like stigmatized and labeled a gang member and was just constantly shaken down by guards. And he said, like, he started painting pretty roses and flowers and like learned how to crochet because he's like, I needed something soft in this space, right? The space of austerity and with like concrete and clanking, right? And so that there was a way that art became that space for him to do that and not be at all stigmatized or judged for that kind of work.
It's a section in James's essay where he talks about learning a new language. And he talks about the concrete and the clanking and the sounds of prison and the way that those sounds like shape your experience of the world. And that's a part of that double consciousness. So it's interesting to hear you invoke those same terms because they are quintessentially like I came home and I was driving. I wasn't driving because I didn't have a license. And I was not going to break the law 2 seconds after being released from prison. I waited a day.
In another car. In another car, too.
Another car, right? Well, it was T.I.'s, though. It was T.I.'s, that song, it starts with a prayer. And then you hear, like, the cell door clink. And I just thought, I'm leaving prison and I'm back in prison immediately because of the song. It took me back to all of these moments I knew in prison. So it's interesting how there is a kind of series of symbols, a series of tropes, a series of moves that I think artists might resist using in their art because those things capture too much in prison.
Yeah. Most of the visual artists I know don't use bars and that kind of, this kind of iconic and familiar representation. And I mean, one of the questions that I think was even framed by Humanities New York was thinking about representation inside and outside. And I love how you complicate that idea. But I think what drew me to like doing the work on like aesthetics and visual practices made in prison is like, because that world making was so unfamiliar to me. It was not at all this kind of canned iconography that we see in like TV shows and documentaries. It was something very different that was happening, and it was always to me brimming with possibility. And one of the things that I could see, like to me, a kind of recurring like through line is just like the kind of manipulation and management of time, because like when you're doing 20 years and the art is often super time consuming and labor intensive because it's also trying to take some control over one's body and one's own labor and using it in the service of art making. But I was thinking, as I was thinking this through though, something that you said that like in your coming of age story, then a question of survival.
Question of freedom, yeah.
Is like your love of reading. I mean, your world making came through reading, and I'm just going back because I'm pushing back on this idea of how you frame yourself, because it seemed like you had just this expansive world that was happening in solitary confinement, where you were discovering, like, especially all this amazing Black literature.
I was also discovering wine. No, I was just joking.
What'd you say?
I was also discovering wine.
Oh, okay.
No, just had. Actually, it's so funny though. Like you say that I had a. So I think the creativeness is serious, and what you try to do is find a way to live in the world, and you try to find a way to live where you are. And I remember I had a homie who had a debt. He owed somebody some money, and then there was a white guy in the cell beside me who knew how to make wine. And so I organized a bunch of dudes to like collect all of their jelly for breakfast, all of their oranges, all of their bread. And I passed it to the guy beside me, and he made like 3 gallons of wine. And it was a seriously creative endeavor because you got to burp the bag, because apparently when fruit and things ferment, they create a gas that you got to burp, or it'll just blow the bag up. But you got to burp it at the right time, and then other people Because when you burp it, it smells like a burp of gas, of wine, right? And you don't want the seals to know you're making wine. What I distinctly remember is drinking that time, right? And then deciding I'll never get drunk again. I felt like this was the most vulnerable I've ever been. I was in a hole, and I had, drunk too much prison mash, and I was done. I was like, this is just not a way I want to live my life. So I never drunk again when I was in prison. But the interesting thing about it is I see it as a form of creativity, a form of trying to exist in the world where you are. And so I had that, and it was an option. Do you want to go that route? And I felt like that route numbs your ability to function. And also it creates a series of associations within prison that I didn't want to have. And so I moved away from that. Books created a different series of associations that I wanted to have. But it is true that the experience of a child in prison is anchored to the threat of violence and the fear of violence. And so a lot of times when I think about what my art was able to do, is radically different from what I was able to do. I didn't have mentors who, I won a lot of prizes. I didn't have people, and now, but I didn't have people who I now feel obligated to really deeply and meaningfully shout out, because one, I was a child in prison, and I think it was an era where I didn't get that thing that some of my homies tried to provide for other people, and that other people when I was in got from other folks. I didn't get that, and I didn't get that because prison isn't a place that necessarily inspires trust. But I think art does inspire trust. I think art creates a different kind of clock that you're living by. Even, who was it? We met, it was Jesse. Right. And he's creating these little squares that become this vast thing that I saw there. Right. And it took me years to understand what it meant to produce that, because even for me, that thing seemed radically foreign to my understanding how a person could process time while in prison. So I think that's the other thing that the artist does, is even if you've been in an experience, the artist allows you to understand it in a way that you might not have, particularly the visual artists, in this sense, because they are able to draw on vulnerabilities and a language of softness and love that sometimes as a writer, you got to get really skilled to do,
Well, you said something about what is the function of art inside prisons and carceral facilities, and you said often advocacy will instrumentalize that art, but when it's being made inside prison, often it's for it's useless in some ways, and that's where the value of it is. It's absolutely useless, and the value is in I'm doing something that is just in the service of my own expression. And also, I always see it as also a refusal of what carceral captivity does, which is say that your meaning, that your life has no meaning. And to make art, to me, is all about
it's interesting because
life as meaning.
So I have I live in all of these different worlds, as a lawyer, as a poet, as an ex-con, as a felon. Somebody called me an ex-felon, and I was like, that's just an incorrect use of language. And I know that this is an incorrect use of language because I tried to register for a gun, and they were like, no, you are a felon. But what's interesting is, so I grapple with how organizations deal with this idea of othering a person who has been in prison. And it's both in terms of how they imagine that the work can or should be instrumentalized, but it's also how they imagine a person who did the work exists within their orbit. And it's a hard question to answer because I started this saying that James Davis III is currently incarcerated. I actually want to say James Davis III the way I might say Jason Stanley. Mm-hmm. And the problem is I can't because of prison. So prison is the only elephant in the room. And it persists, and so it creates this kind of catch-22. But I think the organizational critique is valid because I think the organizational critique is one that says how do you value the art of people who have been in prison or are in prison in the same way that you value the art of everybody else? And can you only have a conversation about my work if it's connected to me having been in prison? I would like to say that what your work does is say, you know, you don't know these people exist. And so these people exist as a genre. And that's okay, right? Like Brooklyn Babylon, you know, the novel is like fantastic, right? And it won the LA Times Book Prize. And I think Liam is the author, I can't remember the author's name. But it's just like, but it really is just a detective book. Main character has Tourette's. It's just really like funny and like brilliant book that lifts up out of the genre. But nobody's pretending like it's not a genre. But Walter Mosley, you know, the Easy Rawlins mysteries are like, it's a mystery, it's a genre. But it's okay to have a genre, recognizing that sometimes things will lift up out of the genre. And I think one of the things that you've done is established like this group of people who exist as being like radically distinct because of their experience of confinement, and then create room for the rest of us to think about who will lift up out of that genre. The problem is that most of us don't want people to lift up out of the genre. So I don't want to be considered like, I don't want to be considered like a formerly incarcerated poet, a felon poet, a prison poet. Like, I want to be considered the poet laureate of the United States if anybody in the audience is making these kinds of decisions.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because in Marking Time, the book, and in the exhibition, it's not just currently or formerly incarcerated artists, but that's what people always glom onto because I think it's a simple story to sell. And people like these stories of uplift, or like, you know, what somebody in the book said when he was in prison, they would bring like folks around from the Department of Corrections and it's like, look at what the monkeys are doing. They can paint. You know, he said it was literally like putting them on display like that. People forget that, like, also in the book and exhibition are a lot of non-incarcerated artists, like Savoy Lee Smith, Maria Gaspar, Ashley Hunt, who are also working on these extensive art projects that are about investigating the carceral state. And for me, what I saw happening, especially in the visual art world, were these silos, where it's like either work by people in prison or work by socially engaged folks who are like doing, you know, advocacy work, right? That it was just bifurcated in a way that I found really problematic. And I thought only if these works are in proximity in a gallery space together do we start to get really glimpse how prisons and, broadly speaking, punitive governance, that we're always threatened with punishment, really shape our aesthetic practices. And we have to look at that from these different arenas. Like, we have to look at what it looks like in solitary confinement, what it looks like in a youth detention center, what it looks like at Columbia Art School, right? And I want to see how those things are working together, not like in isolation, because I do think, you know, for me, it's just like, it's something that I feel like I'm still like working through, that like the threat of punishment as a way of life, you know, like being constantly fined, like constantly threatened with punishment does shape our aesthetic horizons. And that's what I'm like, in this contemporary moment, like, how does that shape our aesthetic horizons? And how is that a continuation of past moments? And how is it different, you know?
So I actually love it, and I appreciate you saying that for this audience and for the people who watch this later, because as you now said, that people would have watched this and assumed that the reason why we two were talking is because you did time in prison and I did time in prison. Now, you let us know early on that you hadn't done time in prison. I should have confessed that I also haven't done time in prison. It's an elaborate lie because I felt like it would win me fame and good fortune by making it up. But I wonder though, so I think put a pin in what you just said, and it demands like deep exploration, and it is truly a profound contribution to this work, because it is so easy for all of us to imagine that those silos are all that we have. So I get that. I wonder, because I find I go into a prison. I did my show in a prison, so I got this solo show, and it's called Felon in American Washi Tail. And when I did it in MCI Norfolk, which is the prison where Malcolm X was incarcerated. And I do the second sweep. And the second sweep at that time was focusing on two friends of mine. One who had gotten locked up for murder he didn't commit. And then one who had got 53 years for a non-murder, non-homicide, non-rape case. He had took an officer's gun when he was 16, and he said he was turning it on himself, and the officer said that he tried to shoot him, but the gun never fired. And so the second swoop like focused on this. And afterwards, this guy looked at me and was like, but what if they was guilty? And I was like, what you mean what if they was guilty? I mean, most of the people I know are guilty. He was like, nah, I'm saying what you care the same way. I see how you care about your friends, man. I can hear it in your voice. I can see it on the stage, but I wonder would you care if they were guilty? And I told him, I was like, well, you know, my man Juvie got 2 homicides, and I've been trying to get him out for years. And I talked about, you know, my man Luke and my man Star and my man Absolute, all of these folks that, you know, I've been working to get out of prison who are all guilty. One of the questions I have is I feel like we are also in a space where nobody actually like grapples with that question, and I wasn't. Mm-hmm. And I had to revise my whole show based on that conversation, you know. And so I guess my question to you is, how do you think that the artists are grappling with these questions of guilt and innocence, and maybe even the necessity for grappling with violence, and imagining doing it without the kinds of punishments that we know now? Like, I wonder if you find that the visual artists are dealing with those questions, and incarcerated and formerly incarcerated. I didn't say formerly incarcerated as like formerly incarcerated person. I used it as an adverb to modify the word incarcerated. But like how do you feel like folks are grappling with that thing?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, you know, what comes to mind immediately for me is like, when I think about art being made in carceral facilities, I don't think it's all, quote, liberatory or, you know.
Or even good.
Or definitely not all good. You know, one of my friends who used to work for Boston Reviews was working in the poetry section or something, said that most of their submissions were coming from prison. And they would say, American poetry is not dead, it's just doing 5 to 10.
I don't know if that's funny or like crass. Like, and I'm embarrassed that I'm laughing on camera. Like, my poets are going to be so upset with me. That's a great joke.
But like, I mean, yeah. My point is that there's just such an outpouring of art making in prison, right? But it doesn't mean that it's, you know. I mean, you said taste making was also something that came up. Like, what is taste making inside prison? And I do think that the currency of art in prison is very different than when people are in a larger kind of commercialized art world. And I say that because a couple of the artists I know who, when they came out of prison, they said they struggled making art in the, quote, free world. And they said part of it was because everything's so monetized, even getting supplies. Like, they were used to working with the idea of the scarcity of materials in prison was part of like the prompt for making something, like what can I get my hands on? And in some ways that risk-taking was part of what was fueling some of their inventions, right? And so they had to kind of retool, and they were not romanticizing going back to prison at all, but it was kind of retooling like how we think about our relationship to making, you know, and for some folks it was resisting being in a 6 by 9 foot cell, so they were doing these different panels, like Jesse Crimes' piece that you're talking about, Apocalypting, which is 39 prison bed sheets made over a 3-year period, where he complete a bed sheet and find a way of sneaking it out of prison, and wasn't able. I love how
we talk about finding a way of sneaking it out of prison. What we mean, like putting it in an envelope and mailing it.
Well, having a friend in the mailroom too, right?
They don't open your mail when it goes out of the prison. I love Jesse though. I think that was phenomenal, but I also think that like
it's easier. What?
Not necessarily that it was easier that he explains it, but like the whole beauty of all of it, right, is that difficulty. It is that scarcity, because that is the thing that is like the source of the inventiveness and the fear. And I think the real fear for all of us is when you're free, how can you exist in a world that no longer puts those same constraints on your time, that no longer puts those same constraints on your creativity, and it no longer values it in the same way? Because in prison, what you also recognize is that you are one of few who could do a thing, and you're MacGyver.
Yeah.
And like, how do you operate when you're no longer McGavin?
And you have a value, and people value, like there's a value system placed on art that's very different. This is all from me being a student, not knowing from experience. But I want to go back to this question of violence. And how to, I mean, I'm sitting here as someone who, has at least 3 people in my family who've been convicted of murder.
Yeah.
Over my lifespan, right? So it's a question I sit with just in my own, when I think about like how we continue to love these folks, love hard. People have done some stuff that they can never undo, that's impossible to undo, right? And that other families are constantly grieving folks that my family have removed from this world, Yeah. So I can't ask that question of artists in the book or people, in the world of research and just my social life without just thinking about how it reflects on my own family. And how my family walk around with, we carry the shame. When I'm back in the town I grew up in, I carry the shame of knowing that people are no longer here because of relatives of mine who've taken their lives.
Yeah.
So it's something that I think about a lot, and I also think that prisons aren't the answer for that. So I'm constantly thinking, like, what is the answer for that? One of the things that I know is that we keep loving hard those folks who have done some really awful stuff. The other thing, though, I want to say about that, though, is this thing about art and prisons and violence. There's, do you know this black serial murderer? Like, he killed like 90 people or something like that. He's like the most that people have known in like contemporary era, and mainly black women. And he made a portrait of every single person he killed.
Get the fuck out of here.
In prison. It was in the New York Times a few years ago. And I was thinking, like, I talked about this idea of carceral aesthetics. I'm like, that's carceral aesthetics. That's not how I've been embracing the concept, but like, he has made detailed portraits of every woman he murdered.
I just don't actually know how to respond. And I think in 2 ways. It's like, we talk about trying to instrumentalize art, and that's this expectation that art should have answers. And I think we're talking about in the context of advocacy, in the context of like criminal justice reform, in the context of mass incarceration. But I think the reality is that art is meant to trouble, and I think that art is meant to give us a way to understand that we are troubled.
That we are troubled. I think so.
Yeah, and so
that it's we have a mutual friend, Mitch Jackson, who's talked about writing with the wound, like that and I think making art with that wound is also what I think is really evident in art made in prison. But I think that like the art that we're drawn into, that other people's wounds help us reflect on our own.
I gotta look that story up. All right, we should ask the audience if they have some questions. If not, we have other things to say to each other.
And you have a poem too, maybe. Or...
Oh yeah, I gotta read a poem too. I'll read it. I'll read it after the first question.
Yeah, it's not on. I don't think.
Moment, I think you can all hear me. And now it is working. Hi, I'm Joe Murphy. Thanks, Dwayne and Nicole. If you have a question in the audience, now's the time. Raise your hand. We have 4 mics roving in the room. Someone will come to you with the microphone and hand it over for your question. So, yes.
Thank you. This is a question for Dwayne. You started writing poetry in prison, am I right?
Yes.
How has, after you left prison and you've continued writing poetry, how has the absence of that particular form of constraint impacted your poetic writing experience? Thank you.
The reason why that's a difficult question is because we spent a lot of time talking about constraint. And as a poet, you know, I write sonnets, I write ghazals, I write haiku. Haiku is a beautiful practice. I've written in blank verse. I got a 300-line poem that's all in blank verse. I think that artists find constraints as a way to shape their work. And sometimes those are natural constraints, and sometimes those are chosen constraints. And so in some real way, prison was just a constraint, right? But it wasn't as if prison was the conduit. It might have been the catalyst for my writing, right? But it was just a constraint, and I found other constraints. And the way those constraints have always functioned is honed in the way I thought about the world. But one of the first poems I published was about a father with two sons who is like, you know, he goes back to his old neighborhood to finding the children playing in the street on a Friday night with his wife and his sons say has turned to stone in his own eyes. And I wrote that as like a, you know, 20, 21-year-old kid who hadn't kissed a woman in like years, you know? And so I think that the constraint of prison had me thinking about a real world experience that now I have two sons, the irony of it, right? And it had me thinking about the future in a way. So I think the constraint of prison put me in a place where I could think about the future. But when I came home, it's not that I needed prison as much as you find other constraints. And those might be the demand to write a poem a day, or it might be, you know, a friend of mine is getting married, and so I'm gonna write a poem for the friend that's getting married, or somebody's son is murdered, and I'm writing a poem for a friend's murdered son. So I think, so I think it wasn't prison as much as the need for constraints to help shape my own vision.
But you found out that you were a poet when you were in prison.
No, I found out I needed to be somebody when I went to prison. And so I said that I was going to be a writer. I had no idea what it meant to be a writer. I just said I'm going to be a writer. And then a year and a half, 2 years after that, I decided to be a poet. But because I got that book, The Black Poets, and I was like, oh, this is the kind of writer I'll be. But the first impulse to be a writer was just to be somebody. Like I had these 9 years, and I had to imagine a way to fill it up in a way that I would find meaningful. But I could have decided to be a dancer. I mean, I didn't, right? But like it was just this idea of I thought writing was a more serious possibility than anything else. And I just picked right, you know? I mean, I feel like the luckiest moment of my life was just, I was like, you know what, I'm gonna be a writer. And if somebody would have said, what kind of writer, it might have ruined my life forever. Because I'd have been like, I don't know, cartoonist, you know? But because I had nobody to confess this desire to, I just made up what it would be in my head. And then when I got that poetry book, I was like, this is the kind of writer I'm gonna be Etheridge Knight. Because Etheridge Knight had been locked up. And we go back to representation. You know, the fact that I thought of him as a poet that had served time in prison allowed me to imagine myself being him in a way that I never imagined myself, like being Langston Hughes or Sterling Brown or Sonia Sanchez or Lucille Clifton or a whole host of other writers that I imagined. It was when I read the idea of ancestry, and more importantly, it's when I read For Freckle-Faced Gerald, which it has a line that the 16 years hadn't done a good job on his voice. So with his precise speech and innocent grin, he couldn't quite win the trust or the fists of the young black cats around him. And he said that the loss of his boss was plotted years before the men who at night light upon his back, right? And it was about this 16-year-old who was in prison who couldn't win the trust and the support of his peers and was ultimately raped in prison. And I read this poem as a 16-year-old in prison, and I'm like, damn. One of the things that it means to be a poet is that you survive to tell the story. Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna be a poet because it predicts my survival, because Gerald didn't write that poem, Etheridge wrote that poem. The other thing that poem did was gave me a sense of history that I had no idea of. I thought, woe is me, I'm in prison as a teenager, and I was like, wait, they were sending teenagers to prison in the 70s. Mm-hmm. And it gave me a different sense of the scope of the problem. So anyway, that was like a tangent. I wasn't even answering a question. My apologies. This is your time now.
How you doing, brother? I appreciate you, and I appreciate you too, sis. One thing, when I had the opportunity to Zoom with you, through PPI, through Columbia University, their paralegal initiative, you spoke to some things that really helped me with working with the youth and having been formerly incarcerated. It's something you told me where I used to focus so much on legal writing and trying to be so much of a lawyer. You told me something during that Zoom about focusing on reading books and getting people more acclimated to reading, becoming avid readers. And as they become readers, they'll become writers, and then they'll have a better understanding. And I'm starting to try to take that in the community more with the youth. And I appreciate you greatly, brother, because like I said, your story is not just a story that, it's the story that many of us need to hear. You hear that from jail to Yale, but you don't actually get a chance to see how personal and up close you really are and how you open up and you give people true inspiration. And that's commendable, man. I pray that God rewards you with all this good for that, man, because we need more of you. We need more brothers who want to understand the importance of reading, because as I'm in this genre of academic writing, I'm seeing where we were lacking in regards to certain information and how to go about properly doing things in a way that would be socially accepted and also allow us to have more credence and visibility and being able to address issues. When you have that reading and writing, it takes you out of that mindset of wanting to be aggressive. You're reading. You talked about reading poetry books and pushing books around through the tiers and everything. So everything you spoke to me, I'm basically trying to transfer that to other individuals. And like I said, again, I commend you, and I wish you well in all your endeavors.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that.
Can
Go ahead.
you talk about Freedom Reads? I mean, because it seems like he's inviting that opportunity to talk about this
You are like a
amazing-
generous person. This is like, this is a MacArthur genius here. You give me all this time to talk about
I
myself.
mean,
you talk about your
to
work.
my fellow MacArthur genius.
So I started this organization called Freedom Reads, and with the support of a $5 million grant from Mellon, and also with the
Mellon's
support of the
here.
Ford Foundation, and several other foundations at this point, and several other individuals, including a lot of people in this room who are going to go to the website afterwards and follow us and support us. But what we do is we build libraries in prison, and the pandemic showed that this was necessary in ways that I felt was needed, but the pandemic made it obvious. If you work a full-time job, like raise your hand if you've been to the library in the past month. You guys are in college. But like this is a August audience. But like most of us can't go to libraries because we work in full-time, right? And if you're in a prison, you can work full-time in a prison. And so how are you going to get to the library? But more importantly, a prison housing unit is frequently a decrepit place. It is a place without beauty. I think, Mass Design, I partner with them to build these modules, these libraries. The libraries are modular because it depends on the size of the space, how big they'll be. So we just opened one in Logan Correctional Center in Chicago. It's a women's prison in Chicago, and it was 4 modules. The libraries come with 500 books. The collection is 500 books, but we put duplicate copies in depending on how big the library is. It's made of walnut or maple or oak or cherry. It's 44 inches high, so when you come to this beautiful curved module and you're looking at the books, you get to look at the person across from you. And it is amazing how it invites this profound and robust conversation about what it means to hold a book in your hand. And part of the beauty of being supported by Mellon actually is that I have read a poem by Elizabeth Alexander, In Every Shut Eye and Sleep, and I wanted to read more of her work, and I got it through Interlibrary Loan. But the thing is, I was proximate to the library. And so when I was asked by Julie, what would you do if you could do more? I was like, I have just gotten the greatest opportunity I've ever had in my life. More? There is no more. And I was like, well, look, books are like water. You think about books are like the ice cubes. And we, the people, are like water. You take a glass of water and you put enough ice cubes in it, the water overflows. If you think about the glass as prison, if you put enough books in it, I believe that the people will find their way out because they'll be noticed, they'll be seen, they'll find support. And so anyway, we have opened 25 libraries in prisons across the country, in New York, in Massachusetts, in Louisiana. We opened libraries in Angola. People would tell me, you can't get a CO to agree to this. You can't get a warden to agree to this. No commissioner will agree to this. And we worked with the highest level of the DOC in 6 different states. We opened up libraries in Rikers, and people say we need to shut Rikers down. You shouldn't be opening libraries. You shouldn't be bringing beauty to Rikers. I'm like, how much time have you done? Because unless you got a portal that's going to free these people today or tomorrow or next week, unless you've been inside the prison and sat at the table with the brother who says, you know, I got 2 natural life sentences. If you haven't been there, then you can't tell me that he doesn't deserve a modicum of beauty and an opportunity to create a community that like the brother said, books had a potential to decrease aggressiveness. Books had a potential to decrease violence, but more importantly, maybe books had a potential to build like a shared community and a mutual understanding of the world. And it is certain kind of books. You know, it is Toni Morrison. It is William Faulkner. It's Shakespeare. You know, it's a wide array of books. And I've been deeply moved, actually. You know, I got this video of this cat, man. He in Angola. He walking down the boulevard. It is the quintessential image of a prison photo. You know, he's walking down the boulevard, and he's like, yeah, this started in here. And he points at some wooden chairs that folks in prison have made. He's like, I did 25 years in here. Brother looked like he 20 years old, got me pissed off, you know. He talk about he my age, he ain't got no gray hairs, right? He's like, I did 25 years in here. I started building stuff like this. Now I'm building libraries. Is it a success story? I think so. And behind them, you got these guys that's building, that's walking in these beautiful, like, walnut bookshelves. And so that's what Freedom Reads is about. You know, we've done 25 so far. We'll have done 50 by the end of the year. And truly, you know, I try to characterize it as not an instrumental thing. You know, we have metrics that matter. But the first metric that matters most is that we show up and we bring a library. Because I think that that's the first marker of civilization. And by putting it on a housing unit, by putting it in a dormitory, it means that when you walk out of that cell door, you're reminded that it is still somebody who thinks that your life has meaning, you know. It's both art and literature.
Beautiful. Thank you.
I really appreciate this this conversation. Many years ago, I taught art in a jail in Hartford. It's been destroyed since, in Morgan Street, in the 90s. And I was there my senior year in college. I was studying the carceral system, so I said, I want to go up to the prison. I went up to this jail, and they asked me to volunteer. And then I was doing it 3 to 4 times a week. I was taking a 4 a.m. bus up to Hartford from Middletown and teaching art. And we painted murals in the cafeteria. We did all sorts of things. But what I remember was the social aspect of the art making. These were about 5 prisoners that were on furlough sometimes. They were going to classes. They'd been incarcerated more than 20 years, all of them. And I guess they had good behavior. And we were going on a bus together to go get paints. We were leaving we were in one of the prison buses. We were leaving. And they wanted to keep me overnight. I was like, no, look, I got to go back to school. That kind of thing. But it was an incredible experience. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the social aspects of art making in prison, and if you've had any of those experiences.
You said a lot of yours was in isolation, like without mentorship.
Well, no, the writing, writing is solitary. You know, but actually, I was working at a parole packet for a friend of mine, this cat named Anthony Wynn, and I was like, man, send me all of your certificates. You know, I'm working on this joint now. I gotta show what you've been doing. And he sent me a program from February 2003, and it was a Black Excellence, a Black History Month event at the Augusta Correctional Center, and my name was on the list of poets. It was the first time that I had read a poem out loud, and and they had like clowned me out of the 4 poets. I was like the worst one, you know what I mean? I made do since then, but but the thing is, like, writing is solitary. But like me and him, we would walk the yard and we would talk about writers. I started a book club in prison. So I, sit down and chop it up with cats. I helped this other cat get out of prison. His name is Kevin Williams. But I remember they had these yellow lines that you couldn't cross, and they had red lines. And if you crossed the red lines, they were gonna shoot you. And if you crossed the yellow lines, they would just put you in a hole, right? And my homeboy was like, "Yo, Shaheed, come to my cell, man. I got this new book." You know what I mean? And I crossed the yellow line and checked the book out. And he was like, "Bex, I told you, stop crossing the yellow lines." I was like, "It's just for education. You're gonna get educated in the hole." And they put me in handcuffs, and so they open up the top tier, and this cat Kevin, man, he kicks his lock out, and he's like, "If Shaheed going to the hole, I'm going to the hole." And then a bunch of dudes is yelling, "If Shaheed going to the hole, I'm going to the hole." And the dude whose cell I went to, he banging on the door like, "Y'all opening my door up now, I'm going to the hole too." And the sergeant was like, "Go back to your cell, some shit. I don't care if you say reading is fundamental, right?" And he put me back in my cell. So, but the point of it is like you asking about community, and I think the community around books exists in a different way than the community around art. I was like a librarian and all of that. There was community there, but it's not the same as.
Yeah. I mean, with the visual art, my experience has been that so many people, one of the things is a lot of the artists have said that it is one of the spaces in prison where you can cross like racial, ethnic, religious boundaries, because prisons generally are, like apartheid systems, and people are, segregated based on how they're classified. And in prison, in art rooms, it becomes a sanctioned space where people are really coming together across all these differences. And I think one of the most profound things that I've learned is just how people resource pool. Like they'll share resources. They'll do like furtive planning together. If you need something over in this room and I'm working in that room, I'll bring it out for you. A lot of peer mentoring takes place, so people, there's what drives me crazy is when I read something that's related to marking time or an artist in prison and they say self-taught. I find it so problematic, because it is like first of all, there's a long tradition of art making in prison. As long as our, prisons have been around, people have been envisioning and creating and imagining what freedom looks like and materializing that in various ways. But there's a really, storied tradition of art making in prison. And there's certain aesthetic currents that you will kind of run alongside of non-incarcerated artists, but also traditions that are very specific to prison, and some of that is like ephemeral art with like soaps and, just with materials that people can get access to that might, not last very long, right? And so for me, that type of world making and arranging like social life is, it profoundly changed my life, because it also, like, we often limit ourselves to thinking about what's possible, right? And so people are like just forging all these kind of relationships and ways of making art and making do under like some of the cruelest conditions that we have created in modern society. So it really has profoundly changed my life, just thinking through and learning from people about how art can completely rearrange one's social relationships, inside and outside, or just kind of abandoning that inside-outside system too. Because a lot of artists, there are a few artists in marking time who, forged their way to freedom through their art making by, using their art as part of their like defense campaign, as a way of connecting with organizations, as a way of just building these kind of alliances and relationships that really profoundly changed their trajectory.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that about the mentorship piece, because I feel like we too often think that like sui generis, and we don't think about what the lineage is of the people that help create the artists that exist now, and the way in which some of those artists within the book are nurturing other artists and creating another generation of artists. But that's why it bothers me a little bit. I hear what James says. It's like the notion of double consciousness is also this notion of like, this thing is true, but you don't want it to be true. And how can it be both true and untrue at the same time? Because the world that you're describing is a rich world of relationships, of love, of complicity and something other than violence, other than sorrow, other than desperation. And that is like the human world that we live in, right? And you can't say that that's not the world, except at the same time, it is something profoundly unsettling about not being able to walk down the street at night. And so it's like you have to hold both of those things in your hand at the same time. And how do you get me to acknowledge my dignity when I'm like 20 in a cell, while also allowing me to acknowledge how profoundly unjust this is, while also allowing me to acknowledge how horrible I feel about this thing that I've done, while also allowing me to acknowledge that, like, you know, I was once talking to somebody I hope get out of prison, and I was talking to his mom, and she's like, what are you saying when your kid has murdered somebody? Like, I raised him better than that. And I'm like, fuck, you know, I can't, well, whatever we say, we can't say it in the parole packet, which already means that we've decided that we can't be honest, and there's something troubling about that. I think this young lady in the back wants to ask a question.
Thank you both very much. I'm struck by, it was just so beautiful, this idea that the first metric is showing up. I just appreciate that as kind of an educational principle. But I also wanted you to talk about that in terms of the double consciousness, the sense that bringing books and a library and its impact or interaction with that double consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually gotten a lot of people out of prison. I mean, not a lot compared to the people who are in prison, but like a lot compared to like, yo, homie, we were together at 16. And because I kept writing juvie, then Fats was able to say, yo, Shaheed, will you help me? And then juvie gets out, and then Fats gets out, and then Kevin gets out. And because he kicked that locker into the hallway when he's like, yo, will you help me? I was like, I gotta help you, you know? And so I think that notion of the first metric is showing up. Is the reality is that when you show up, whatever your vehicle is for showing up, it changes you actually build relationships with people. 100%. And, you know, and so even me starting with James Davis III, I mean, this dude, I met him, I went to this class, right? And I go in there and they were like, yo, Dwayne, can you be a lawyer if you've been locked up? I start laughing, right? And he was like, no, I mean, I know you could be a lawyer, but I mean somebody like me. I start laughing even louder, because I'm like, who do you think I am, right? Except you. And he was like, no, we just saw this thing on a ticker, and it was like somebody went to Yale Law School, and they're not gonna let him be a lawyer.
Like,
and I was like, that was me. And then you should have seen their faces, though. I mean, they was like, what the fuck? I mean, you've been coming in here. We know you. How they not gonna let you be a lawyer? And I mean, and they were unsettled by this shit, right? And I was like, nah, it's cool, man. I'm gonna be a lawyer. Because it wasn't even like fun and games anymore. This was like the world is profoundly unjust, and I don't know how to respond to this right now, what you telling me. And then I had to backpedal. I was like, no, I mean, this is cool. This is just a good story that I'm gonna tell later. Well, inside, I was like, I might not be a lawyer, but I'm not gonna sit in this room with these dudes doing life, telling them that I did all of this and it was for nothing, right? That they see me as possibly being somebody, and now I gotta tell them that that's going to ashes, right? So I'm like, no, it's straight, don't sweat it. And the wild thing is, I get admitted, but I get admitted the day I find out I'm also giving this speech in Connecticut. So I drive from New York to Connecticut, and I almost crashed my car 3 times. I was listening to Dolly Parton, and she was keeping me awake. I've been telling her I owe her one. She's not responding to none of my tweets, pissing me off, right? But I get there, and I'm giving a speech in front of the executives of the Department of Correction all across the country, or at least in the northern region, right? And it was organized by Scott Simple. So when he introduces me, he gives me this plaque that says Reginald Dwayne Betts, attorney at law, because somebody had told him that I had got appointed, right? And that I was good. So I get a speech, and then this is like on a Friday. On that Monday, I'm back in the same classroom that James Davis was in. I'm in a classroom, and I'm like, yo, let me tell y'all this story. You know, because they congratulated me. I was like, yeah, you know, and I was giving a speech in front of all of these heads and leadership of the DOC 2 days ago, and Scott gave me this plaque. And a dude that's in there said, I made that shit. And I was like, what? He was like, yeah, man, I didn't actually make it,
but I work in the shop and I got the order and my man made it. Because in a lot of states, if an agency orders like furniture or something, they got to order it from the DOC. The point is, the dude, he got locked up when he was a juvenile. He got parole now, he's out now. He got locked up when he was a juvenile, but he made the plaque, and I'm in this room, and don't nobody believe the story we telling each other. It's like, this is not just improbable. This is not even real. You're making this up. This is some shit we watch on Lifetime, right? But the point is, all of that happens because I show up. And I do seriously believe that the steps from like showing up to freedom, the steps from showing up to a deep relationship are hard to tease out, right? But when we do freedom reads, or when you look at Mark in Time, you're asking a different question about the relationship between people who are here in this room and people who are in prison. And the walls are far more porous than we admit. You know, I was just there as a guest, and so I do think that that the most radical thing that we could do in terms of having a conversation about mass incarceration might not be to read the latest screed about how horrible the system is. It might be to remember that the correctional officer is your neighbor. It might be to remember that like the person who got a body is loved by somebody. It might be to remember that like all of those things become far more true when you go into those spaces.
I cannot say enough how important like showing up is in all these situations, and it's been my greatest teacher. And sometimes you don't know why you're showing up or what to say or do when you show up, but being there matters. Absolutely.
Hey, how you doing, Nicole and Dwayne? My name is Alex, and
Hi, Alex.
I'm not stalking you, brother. I know you wondering about that, but
Nah, man.
Does Alex come to all your events?
the whole idea about, because you just brought it up, about showing up. I want to tell you a story that when I got incarcerated at 16, individual, when I was in prison upstate, an individual showed up that had did time and came back to the facility to deliver a message. And in that message, he said, and I never read it, but in it, he said that Malcolm X said that prison can be your place of confinement or it can be your university. And I never found out where Malcolm said that, but it just resonated with me at the time at 16 years old, dropping out of school in the 5th grade, couldn't read or couldn't write. It just told me what I can do with my time. I had 15 years for a manslaughter that I didn't commit, but because I was in the gang, I was involved in it and was forced to plea bargain for it. But the point that I want to make is about showing up. That individual showed up, and what he said, but how he presented it to me, right? That there was a possibility. There was a way out of this life that I was living. And a couple of years later, another individual heard me talking. I was what they call a 5%. I don't know if you know, but I was call myself a guard body. And he heard me talking, the older brother on the gate, and he said that I sounded like someone that was searching for knowledge but didn't know what I was searching for. And he showed me 2 degrees. He showed me a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. And he said, what you do with your time is you get these, because when you leave, they can't take it from you, right? And so in terms of showing up, yesterday I went for orientation to go on Rikers Island. I've been trying to go on Rikers Island for a couple of years now, but finally, they gave me they opened the door for me. And I wanted to know, what could I say to these young people, right? Because I know they're not going to want to hear about read a book. It'll get you out of here, right? But that's the truth of it, right? So I was wondering, like, what you've been on records. I know you've been out there, and I'm getting ready to go out there as an artist. I do theater art with narratives and with stories. We put them into an art form. What is it that I should say? Because most of the time they call me an OG. OG, that was years ago. We ain't doing that no more, right? Yeah. So, what can I say to you?
So I have been to Rikers, and in fact, I'm doing my show there on November 1st. I'm going back on November 1st, and we opened some libraries on Rikers. This is what I really do think, though, right? I think that you get there and you start having this conversation, and you find what to say by having a conversation. I think that people don't necessarily want to be preached at, and they want to hear that you ain't got all of the answers, right? And they want to just know that you're there. And I do think it's different when I come into a space, because I'm coming to a space, and I know I'm about to leave. So I go to Logan Correctional Center, or I go to Statesville, or I go to Otisville, and I'm going to leave. And so I think I gotta think about my role in a different way. And I try to lead with my art, and then try to figure out a way to talk to them and answer the questions that they have. But I do think that when you're there, you're there. And I do think that you lead with the art, because you said it, you get into prison and you had dropped out in the 5th grade and you were illiterate. But stories don't need the written word to exist in the air. And that's one of the powers, I think, of theater. And so I think you coming in, and the first thing you're doing is animating how these stories could exist, and you helping them tell their stories. And so I actually think it's not a thing that you could say, besides what you just said to me. What you just said to us is what I would say. I would say what you just said to us says a few things. One, that you didn't get it on the first time. That on the first time you heard the thing about Malcolm, but you had to hear it again. The other thing you said is like, you've been uneducated. We walk into these spaces. They said, no, I know you a lawyer. I mean somebody like me. I'm like, what does that mean? 251534 is my state number. What do you mean somebody like you? As if we not the same. And when you walk into that space, those kids will think that you and them ain't the same. And that story reminds them that however you present on the morning that you show up or the afternoon you show up, you got a history that matters, that's intertwined with their experiences. And then I think the second story is even more powerful, right? Because it's like, we all been reaching. We haven't all been 5%ers, but I know what a 5% is. All of my homies is like, wise and righteous and mathematics, But also, we've all had to be exposed to different levels of what it means to get knowledge. And I think that other part of that story is just as powerful. But the main thing I would say is, man, we come in with art. And I think coming in with art gives them a vehicle to understand that their lives matter, because it gives them a vehicle to see how their stories matter. And ain't nobody else gonna be showing up. You're gonna be there though. And this was delightful. And we even finished on time. We had a running bet. We were trying to see how long we could keep y'all in the room. But Nicole said that was highly inappropriate, and we needed to leave and respect you guys' time. So.
Well, please join me, everyone, in thanking our speaker, Nicole. Wonderful.
You didn't read your poem. You didn't read your poem.
And thank you all for coming out this evening and watching on the live stream. For those in the audience tonight, if you've brought a book, we do have book signing tables set up just outside this door at the exit here in the foyer.
I got to do one more thing.
Please do.
The poem. He was going to read a poem.
Oh. I'm going to read a poem, because I told Nicole I was going to read a poem.
And this is like...
Facts ain't never killed nobody. But it's no more years in cells than cities, than school, than lovers. More years than his favorite cousin lived. We met back before B ran his time up over the 5-inch black and white. Before K broke somebody's jaw with the lock in a sock. Back when everybody thought they'd go home. Before P went home and was murdered. Before J went home and came back. And the kite, he gives me the man for men I did my bid with.
Yesterday, I was sitting at a table with Star. Remember him? I was staring at his bald head, and he was staring at the grays that cover my crown. Juvie sat at a near table, both crown and beard stubble completely gray. Star, Juvie, Fats, me, we first discovered sales decades ago as teenagers. And I thought, Fats, recounting a moment he shared with men he's known for a score of years in prison, was thinking about all that loss. And just this morning, a mirror reminded me of my disappearing youth. Androgenic alopecia, a word for our vanishing hair, Latin describing how time will cause everything to recede. There is no word for all we've lost to prison. And I thought, Fats, recounting a moment he shared with men he's known for a score of years in prison, was thinking about all that loss. But he writes, staring at that landscape of gray that had become us, I realized it was far from over. Because all these rounds later, prison ain't still undefeated. And one of these days, we might find us some free. Thank you. Sorry.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dwayne Betts and Nicole R. Fleetwood. Thank you. And again, we have book signing tables set up in the foyer. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.